Welcome to the Stories That Shape Us podcast. My name is Joanna Daniel. In this episode of the podcast, I want to talk about the piece that Channel 4 did around abuse in the Seventh-day Adventist Church and how it was dealt with. Now, I am doing this a week after the piece was done on Channel 4. Why have I waited a week? I waited because, lots of things was going on. And I also was reflecting on how I felt about that, how I felt about the church's response, how I felt about their response after the news piece. And if you have been here before, you would know that I've been working with abuse and Christians who experience abuse for many years. And not just in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, I worked across denominations and I see similar responses in other places around allegations of abuse, not just sexual abuse, but domestic abuse. And so while the news cycle might move really quickly, they've already been dealing with something else. The people who experience abuse haven't moved on. Some people stay stuck in that same place for decades. As we see in the news report, the gentleman who spoke, and he wept, and it happened when he would 50 odd years ago, and it still had a massive impact on his life. It's still impacting his life. He went to the police after he was well into his 60s and had a stroke and realized that I have to start talking. The thing is, people who experience abuse, they don't move on. They are still in the same place often. And it's not because they're unforgiving. It's not because they don't want to move on. It's when we experience trauma, it's recorded in our bodies. The nervous system is impacted. Our brain is impacted. Sometimes all of our organs are impacted. We can't just move on as quickly as the news cycle move on, or maybe the church move on and dealing with something new. So that's why we need to keep talking about abuse. We need to keep talking about abuse that happens in the church. We need to keep talking about abuse that happens in our families, in our homes, that, in families that are covering abuse, in churches that cover abuse historically. We need to talk about it. And I see a lot of people post about, speaking out. And some people ask, why do people not speak out when there's an allegation of abuse? And there was a response on my Facebook page that I feel really speaks to why. And the respondent said that sometimes people don't speak out because they're afraid of repercussions. They're afraid of losing friends. They're afraid of losing family members. And that's why people don't speak out sometimes. But I've started talking about this and I have not introduced myself. If you are new here, my name is Joanna Daniel. I am a counselor and an author. And I've been working with people who experience abuse for maybe 20 years or more. And I write courses and deliver courses for survivors of sexual abuse, especially Christian women who survive sexual abuse. So that's what I've been doing for many years. And that's why this hit really close to home. And so that's why I want to talk about this a little bit. So how do I feel about people had different responses to the Channel 4 piece, and many people send it to me. Many people send me the Channel 4 news piece, they send me the church's response, they send me lots of other people's responses, and people send me because of what I do. Now, how do I feel about the church's response? There are a couple of things I feel about the church's response. The responses from the church ranged from mildly empathetic to you should not have responded. It's best if you had kept silent. And there are different leaders who responded. And when people send it to me, it's in varying degrees of anger and frustration about lack of empathy in some of the responses. One of the things that the church, and I'm going to keep looking up and down because I made notes because I wanted to speak to this topic and do it justice, right? So one of the things I see that the church did, which I see churches do often, and it's deniability. They're saying, they keep stressing, and it's in all the responses. The church all the leaders are stressing that this has been a long time ago. There has been an incident of abuse that happened long time ago. It's in the 60s, they say, it's in the 70s. And we're creating distance between us and this abuse that happened a long time ago. Now, the frustration for people is that they know that abuse is, it's not a long time ago. It might be for this case. It doesn't matter though, because though it happened in the 60s and 70s and people felt let down, they are still living it as if it's now. If you watch the piece, the Channel 4 piece, and I'm going to tag it below this video, you will see how these men are still in pain. So whether it happened a long time ago or not, it's still happening. But I feel like saying a long time ago meant it's not happening now. It's not happening now. And we know that that's not true. You know, we work with people who experience abuse, and, you know, people talk about how the church deals with it daily. And that's why I'm so passionate about the trauma-informed church. That's why I write trainings about the trauma-informed church, because I know there's a lot of leadership that needs to be educated around how to respond to allegations of abuse and how to support victims when they disclose abuse. And we know that there are many people that are today in pain because of responses that was lacking in empathy, responses that was indifferent, responses that protected the organization as opposed to the people. We know that a woman can disclose abuse and she's been living in a domestic abuse home for 20 years, 30 years, 15, 10, many years, and she can disclose that abuse, and her abusive partner will be given leadership in church, and she has to find somewhere else to worship. So we know the way the church responds to abuse is not happening in the 60s and 70s. It's happening right now. And so when the church tried to, act this plausible deniability, it really didn't cut it for many people. And I think this is another thing I see. The church is not really in touch with the people. Many churches aren't in touch with the people who go every day and worship. And so people in administration seem to be way out of touch with how people feel, with what they're feeling, and with what's going on. And, talking about leadership and training and leadership's ability to be empathetic and to be effective listeners, that's a whole nother podcast episode, because I think there's a massive training issue for many people in leadership in many churches across denominations. Also, when the responses talk about the historic abuse, they fail to mention, and I see this a lot on the video, the Channel 4 news piece, that this gentleman was sent across the world to work in Adventist institutions, and he did the same thing in many other countries. Now, the news piece made reference to some of the countries that he went to, and if you read the comments on the news piece, you'll see other people from those countries knowing that he was fired from different institutions as a result of. Now, what we see is that the church passed him around to different places. He did something in Britain, it was reported, and they sent him somewhere else. And that somewhere else sent him somewhere else and somewhere else, and nobody reported it to the police, provide evidence based on what they were given, and nobody did anything. And for decades, this man created havoc in the lives of probably too many people to count. Because if we're thinking about sometimes how victims often go on to, become perpetrators, or the pain of not being able to parent well, or the pain of not being able to have a relationship, or, the pain of not being able to hold on a job. And we know how pervasive the impact of sexual abuse is. So this man has caused havoc in the lives of hundreds, probably, of people, because it wasn't reported. And things like this needs to be reported. Another thing I see is the response from the church was so late. I mean, people called me, and people call me from different churches about this. And we went on the websites, and all day there was nothing on any of the websites. The thing I see, though, that keeps flashing up was the safeguarding statement. And for me, it wasn't a time to share the safeguarding statement. And I think that sometimes churches do that as a tick box exercise. Look, we have safeguarding statements. People didn't follow it. Yeah, maybe people didn't follow the safeguarding statements. And that's the thing I see, that safeguarding statements are available, but people often don't know how to carry them out, or they're not being monitored in how they're carried out. And I'm going to give my recommendations at the end of this video, at the end of this podcast, about what the church can do for to ensure that their safeguarding statements that they're sending around right now can do what it's supposed to do and protect people. Most of the responses that I saw lacked warmth, as I said earlier, and they felt token. The responses felt token. They reiterate the message of the abuse was in the 70s. It was a long time ago. And I said this earlier, if leadership was in touch with people, they would have framed those words very differently, very, very differently. Because you're not just speaking to, you're speaking to people who are hurting. And when you're speaking to people who are hurting, there's a way that you do it that let people know, I know you're hurting and I'm with you in your pain. Maybe they're not, but they should have, there are words that could have been framed in many, many different ways. People just want honesty. People just want honesty. We failed. We failed to protect you. We failed to protect victims, and we're sorry. So I felt some of the responses lack humanity, even because it was more defensive than some of it was gaslighting more than it was empathetic. And I think next time, and I hope there's not a next time, but if they were supposed to respond to something like this again, I hope that they would sit with people who understand this and write responses that was going to speak to people's pain, that was going to restore trust in leadership, that was going to restore people's trust in leadership. Because we know you failed. We see it. We see it. We see it in the tears and the weeping of the people. And your safeguarding statement, and you were telling us that it happened in the 50s and the 60s, doesn't stop us from seeing that you failed. They were failures. And I think the least that the church can do, and churches can do in situations like this, is accept that they've been failures. I don't know, maybe because of legal repercussions, people don't want to do that. But it really will restore faith in the people who worship with you, the people who have put their trust in you to lead them, to say, we failed. We are putting things in place to ensure that we don't fail again. There's something about saying we failed and we believe and we're sorry that is healing to people. If you notice how one of the gentlemen wept when the police said, I believe you, that was just so powerful. The police said, I believe you, and he wept. Maybe nobody had ever said that to him before. Maybe nobody from church has ever said that to him before. Another thing the church kept saying is that it didn't happen on the premises, and it didn't have to happen on the premises for people to believe that you have a responsibility, because it was by somebody who worked for you. It's somebody who you have in high position. It's somebody who is in leadership. It's somebody who is preaching. If somebody who is preaching at your church, and this is something for members, all leaders across denominations to take into account, if somebody from your church in your denomination harms somebody else off-site, they reported it and you still have them in leadership, you have some responsibility. When somebody reports abuse, you have to act. People want to see you act, because you're an organization. Churches are places where people go for safety. Churches are places where people go to learn about God, truth and honesty and integrity. And when they see you platforming somebody who there's an allegation against of such a nature, it means that you are not living out what you teach. And that means we don't have to trust you, because you're talking about honesty and integrity, but you're not living it. And so that's why it's important. And when churches don't believe, they create a second wound for victims. And this second wound, I think sometimes it's even more grievous than the first. That religious abuse that happens when we don't believe you, when he can still serve, when they can still partake and do things so that they do it again and again and again, it creates a second wound for people. I think what these men were talking about was more the second wound than the first. They were like, we believe in church. It was a safe space. And we were hurt there. And that's what I think all the responses that the church gave missed that very crucial piece. And you miss it for people who are watching and looking on and wondering, when I report mine, how are they going to deal with it? So we have to take into account that second wound. And as people, we can't fix the hurt, leaders. You're not able to undo what Donald Kelly did. You can't undo it. But what you have now is people who depend on you, people who trust you, people who put you in leadership to say, how are they going to deal with it? how are they going to be able to care for me after somebody who they were responsible for hurt me? And I believe, again, massive training issue there, because leaders probably aren't trained in doing that depth of pastoral care, and it's really lacking. Safeguarding. There is, I know the Adventist Church have safeguarding policies, and the safeguarding policies has been flying around through WhatsApp messages for the last week around everybody needs to be DBS checked, and all of those tick box exercises that wouldn't have served the victims in this instance, and really don't serve many victims, because one of the things that people who aren't reported don't show up on safeguarding on DBS checks. So how is your safeguarding policies going to work when people are not reporting when an allegation of abuse happened? This gentleman would have been missed altogether because nobody reported him. The police didn't know about him. Well, the police knew because somebody reported in 2009, but he should have been reported, being on the sex offenders register. This allegation should have been shared with other Adventist institutions that he worked in. And as he was moving from one institution to the next, all of this information should have been shared. You're going to be working in a school. Well, he shouldn't have been allowed to work in any organization that work with children and young people. That's just it. He shouldn't have. He shouldn't have been able to have access to vulnerable people. He shouldn't have. And so the safeguarding failed in that regard. And so you may have a safeguarding policy, but how are you implementing the safeguarding policy? Are some people above safeguarding? Are some people above the repercussions of safeguarding? When something happened and when there's an allegation, do you just pass them on to another institution within the denomination, and they don't know, and they're exposed to children and young people, and people are continually getting hurt? So you have a policy, but does it work? If it doesn't work, it probably needs to be revised. Is it fit for purpose? Sometimes I wonder, are the policies written by people on the ground who are working in the field? Maybe so. But the carrying out of the policy, I know, oftentimes falls short, because sometimes people don't know how to carry out the policy. Now, I'm going to say one more thing before I go on to recommendations. Now, warmth. I think this is what should have happened in all Adventist churches last week, Saturday. Every church should have focused on warmth, I'm going to say warming up the members, on letting people know, we know what's happening, this thing has happened, we know the Channel 4 news, people here are hurting, people would have been triggered because of their own historical abuse, people would have been angry, frustrated, all of this would have been happening. It needed to be acknowledged, and the program geared around nurture. I have not heard one place where that happened, and maybe I've missed it. The Adventist churches worldwide, there are millions of members, dozens of churches in the UK alone. I mean, so there's a lot. But if your church did it, let us know in the comments if your church did something specific to be with members and to nurture members in the aftermath of such a massive news report. And I think that's where all the responses from leadership missed, how this would have been impacting the people. I see one response that was a little bit empathetic, just one. And I think they did really, really well. This particular leader did really, really well. He really tried. It was just late, but he really tried in bringing across a message of, we're sorry, we're doing something. I think there's a massive training issue in that regard. So the congregation, it shouldn't have been business as usual in this congregation. Abuse don't just impact the victim that experienced it. It impacts everybody in their lives and the family circle. In this instant, abuse happened. The church is shattered. People are broken. People are hurting. People are looking on to see what care is going to look like coming from the top. And there was not anything that showed me that anyway. Protect victims, protect vulnerable people. Make sure your safeguarding procedure is protecting. Make sure that the people who are working with children and young people know what safeguarding is, know how to carry it out, but they also know how to do reporting, how to record a victim statement, and how to report and how to follow up. Pastors, please, when somebody make an allegations of abuse, don't ghost them. Respond to their messages, respond to their emails, go and visit people. I think visiting might be a thing of the past, where people go visit, where pastors visit and sit with and pray with and nurture. I don't know if a generation of leaders are coming that looks very different, that maybe see their role in a different way. I don't know if it's at the seminary they were trained like this, but I do know there's not a lot of pastoral care happening. And so when something like this happens, there's a lot of wounded and bruised people. I'm going to say this again. I've said it many times. Sexual abuse have long-lasting impact for generations. So because it happened in the 60s, it's impacting people's lives today. We saw that. And so our responsibility in leading people, in when people trust us to come into our spaces to lead, when you do a campaign, people come and accept Christ and they're coming to your church, they have an expectation. And maybe people's expectation, you don't feel like you need to meet people's expectation, but you have a duty to meet people's expectation. You have a duty of care to protect people. And so it really is important that we learn, well, what does that duty of care look like? And how do I carry out this duty of care? And when I failed, because we are going to, because we're humans, because we're going to make mistakes. But when we do, it's important that we accept, that we admit that we failed, that we make mistakes, and we're learning from it. We can learn from it to ensure that these things are not repeated, that we, God forbid, never have another Donald Kelly, never have another news report like this. But, I've been doing this work for as long as I've been doing it. I can say I'm not hopeful that we won't, because also the responses from some of the leaders didn't convince me that anything will change. From here on out, my recommendations: make sure that safeguarding is happening in all the local churches, not just through DBS check, but people know very clearly how to report. People know how to protect children and young people. People know how to safeguard children and young people. People know what reporting looks like, that they're not going to cover up for their friends, and that they're going to try to be impartial when an allegation is made, regardless of who that allegation is against. That they're going to swear to protect women and children, young people, that they're going to swear to protect victims, and that vulnerable people will not be exposed to more harm. So the safeguarding will look like that. Tell us, what are the recommendations? How are you planning to move forward? How are you planning to nurture people in the aftermath of this? How are you planning to show these victims that have already been let down by the church that we're sorry? How are you showing them that you're sorry? How will we know that you've done it? Because we're all watching, we're all looking on, we all have expectations. We're hopeful that the learning that will come from this will be implemented, and we can see physically it's implemented, not only through make sure everybody does the DBS check, but implemented in a way that I'm a mom with my children at church, that I can feel safe, that I know that they're going to be okay, that I alone don't have the responsibility of looking out for them at church, that I don't have to police, that leaders know what it should look like, and people know. I'm hearing that everybody in church is expected to DBS check. I don't work with children and young people. I don't want to go to a church where I have to be DBS checked before I go there. But I would want to go to a church where I know that the leadership have their eyes out, and when an allegation is made, they act really quickly. That they get recommendations from churches. Like when somebody's been transferred from church to church, nobody checks in to say, was this person in good and regular standing, and talk to people and ask questions. I would want to know that when an allegation is made in one church, in one country, that somebody won't just be passed on to another church, to another country, without information being shared about this person, and it goes with them. because otherwise people are left in positions where they're not safe. Now, I don't know what all of that means legally. The church will work that out, and I know you have lawyers that can help you with that, but it has to be in a way that the safety of people is not compromised, because I think sometimes the way decisions are made, people's safety are compromised. There are a lot of learning that can come from the Channel 4 news piece on the failings of the Adventist Church. There are a lot of learning, I believe, that can come from families around how we can protect and safeguard our children. There are a lot of learning that friends can take away from this as well. There are a lot of learning that extended families and the community can take away. How do we protect the people that we love? How do we protect our children? How do we safeguard them? How do we know what grooming looks like? I believe everybody missed the signals and signs of grooming. How do we know what grooming looks like? And what can we do when we recognize that people are being groomed? If you are unsure what grooming looks like, the Safe Relationship Guide that was written by myself and has been used by churches and families to teach children and young people about grooming can help you learn what grooming looks like. And not only that, but it gives people the confidence to set boundaries, the confidence to report quickly. We know that when something traumatic happens, the earlier it's dealt with, the better it is for the victims. And so the Safe Relationship Guide will teach you what grooming looks like, how to set boundaries, build confidence, how to be trauma-informed in your approach, and how to be person-centered in your approach when you're working with children and young people, to spot those signs and to protect them. The link for the Safe Relationship Guide will be below this video. How did you feel about the Channel 4 news? What do you see in your church around protections and how allegations of abuse are dealt with? Put your comments below this video, or you can send me a private message. Thank you for joining me in this episode of Stories That Shape Us. I hope you'll join me on the next story.